Everyone, my name is Xiu-Ying. You may call me Sarah, and today I will be presenting my research on Taiwanese-Australian adoptee identity and belonging through narrative, social identity, and post-colonial perspectives. The study explores how intercountry adoptee negotiates identity across multiple cultural and social environments, particularly within migration and multicultural discourse. I am currently researching my identity construction, belonging, and cultural negotiation among adoptees with a particular focus on Asian intercountry transcultural adoptee experiences. And this is an extension from my thesis in my research interest, which includes narrative identity, digital storytelling, migration studies, and cultural representation. So here will be today's presentation, which will briefly cover first, research background and problem statement. Second, theoretical frameworks and key themes. Third, methodology used in this literature-based case study. And finally, the results and discussion of the study. So this research is a literature-based case study examining Taiwanese-Australian adoptee identity through narrative identity theory, social identity theory, and post-colonial theory. The motivation for this study comes from the continued underrepresentation of adoptee experiences within migration and multicultural discourse. While migration studies often discuss ethnicity, diaspora, and belonging, adoptee perspectives are frequently overlooked despite sharing similar experiences of cultural displacement and identity negotiation. The objective of this research is to examine how Taiwanese-Australian adoptees construct hybrid identities and belonging across different social and cultural contexts. This study contributes to by centering adoptee narratives and challenging assimilationist frameworks that often assume identity integration is straightforward or complete. So the central problem addressed in this research is that Taiwanese-Australian adoptees' hybrid identities remain underrepresented, creating gaps in understanding belonging and identity formation. This leads to two primary research questions. One, how do Taiwanese-Australian intercountry adoptees construct identity and belonging in Australia? Second is how are adoptees' identities represented within migration and multicultural discourse? So these questions are important because adoptees often navigate both visible racial difference and cultural disconnection simultaneously, creating experiences that are not fully captured within traditional migration narratives. So one major theme identified is the adoptee paradox of hypervisibility and invisibility. This section draws on social identity theory and post-colonial perspectives. So Taiwanese Australian adoptees may be racially visible within Australian society due to physical appearance, yet culturally invisible because they may not fully identify with or have direct access to their birth culture. One participant described this experience as being at the center of a Venn diagram, not fully Asian, but also not fully Australian. This demonstrates how external perception does not necessarily align with internal belonging. Although society may categorize adoptees visually within Asian identity, adoptees themselves may experience fragmentation, ambiguity, or exclusion from both cultural groups. This paradox highlights the complexity of hybrid identity construction beyond simplified multicultural categories. So the second major theme involves everyday othering and racial microaggression. Using social identity theory, the findings show how repeated interaction shape identity negotiation over time. So examples would include like, is your English okay? Or racial mockery. So while these incidents may appear small individually, repeated exposure reinforces feelings of exclusion and difference. So many adoptees describe adjusting or negotiating their identity in response to these experiences. At the same time, adoptive families may unintentionally underestimate the impact of racism, especially when families themselves are not racialized in the same way. So this creates another layer of complexity in belonging and identity formation. And then lastly, the third theme is cultural loss, longing, and identity reconstruction. So this section uses narrative identity theory and social identity theory to understand how adoptees reconstruct identity after separation from birth culture. Many adoptees describe feelings of cultural absence, identity gaps, or longing for connection to language, heritage, and history. However, identity reconstruction is not simply about recovering a fixed identity. Instead, it is an ongoing process of negotiating past experiences, present realities, and future aspiration. So the image to the right illustrates how narrative identity is constructed through the integration of these temporal dimensions. So this framework helps explain how adoptees create coherent self-narratives despite fragmented cultural experiences. And then the image on the left that I have created is a conceptual framework used in the study. It combines narrative identity theory with digital and transnational identity scholarship to examine how adoptee identity is shaped across social, cultural, and transnational environments. So these figures are important because they provide methodological transparency and visually demonstrate how the theoretical frameworks connect to the study's analysis and arguments. So this study for this methodology is a literature-based qualitative case study approach. The research applies thematic synthesis to existing qualitative adoptee studies. So the primary source is the literary case study by Stoddard in 2021 is the author of this case, but also supported by supplementary literature related to adoptee identity, migration, and belonging. An iterative coding process was used to identify recurring themes involving identity negotiation, cultural loss, belonging, and social perception. The analysis integrates narrative identity theory, social identity theory, and post-colonial perspectives to interpret how adoptees construct identity across complex cultural environments. So now lastly, in conclusion, the findings shows that adoptees' identity is shaped through ongoing negotiation between visibility, belonging, racism, and cultural reconstruction. The result demonstrates how adoptees experience identity through paradox, including simultaneous inclusions and exclusion across different contexts. This challenges simplified migration and multicultural narratives that often assume cultural identity is stable or easily integrated. But the study also highlights the importance of storytelling, cultural continuity, and representation in supporting adoptees' identity formation. So ultimately, identity should not be understood as fixed or complete, but as an ongoing process of negotiation across social, cultural, and emotional environments. These are my references. And then thank you very much for listening. I now welcome any questions or discussions.